to the conclusion of the...
Yeah, great job. Just begin. How far were we off?
Half a second.
Fourth or third?
2/10. The third.
Can a simple radio conversation change the fate of a whole season in Formula One? What Lewis Hamilton said after the classification in Spain not only surprised Ferrari, he also lit all alarms in his rivals. Are you ready to understand why these words could be the beginning of a revolution? Friday's day at the 2025 Grand Prix was a perfect storm of frustrations for Lewis Hamilton. A pilot accustomed to the top of motor racing was, once again, with an indomitable car. The SF-25, which promised to be Ferrari's redemption, showed worrying symptoms from the first free training session. But the real problem was not visible from the outside. The fault resided in a critical part, the car's floor. This element, essential to generate aerodynamic load due to soil effect, was defective. And that defect was not less. It represented a considerable loss of grip in fast curves and braking stability, returning the unpredictable car. Hamilton, who has been communicating with cars to the limit, soon emitting one of his toughest judgments. The Ferrari was not manageable. These types of statements, coming from a figure like Hamilton, have a weight that goes far beyond the frustration of the moment. They reflect a lack of deep confidence in the technical package, but also an urgent call to the team to act. Because the Briton is not a pilot who easily surrenders, but it is not someone who hides his disappointment when he feels that the machinery they give him is not up to his ambitions. The pressure inside the red garage grew immediately. They knew they could not afford another chaotic weekend. They knew it was not a matter of tense, but of credibility. Ferrari's name is recorded in the history of Formula One, but repeated errors threatened to turn the most legendary team in the championship into a shadow of his past. The technical team reacted with the speed that a champion demands. They worked counter-relish to solve the soil problem, implemented suspension and aerodynamic settings and reconfigured the height of the car to try to recover some of the lost balance. Each return in Saturday's free was monitored to the millimeter. Every Hamilton comment to the engineer Riccardo Adami was recorded as a vital signal. They were not looking for a perfect tuning. They sought to avoid collapse. Thus came on Saturday. With a car in doubt, a team under pressure, and a legendary pilot in search of redemption. What happened later in the classification was not just a good result. It was a statement, an indication that perhaps the change was beginning to take shape. But to understand what came later, you must first understand the magnitude of the abyss that Hamilton was trying to leave. Saturday in Montmello, it was not any day for Ferrari, and much less for Lewis Hamilton. The classification of the 2025 Grand Prix had all the characteristics of a determining session. Stable conditions, a well-made track after 2 days of work, and a silent pressure that crossed each corner of the red garage. In that context, Hamilton achieved a 5th place. But the real event was not in the result, but in what happened immediately after. Because what was said by radio in those final minutes contains more emotional and strategic information than any timesheet. Good execution out there was the phrase with which Riccardo Adami, his career engineer, broke the silence. He was not any fulfillment. It was a clear, precise, almost clinical recognition which said more than it appeared. It meant that, despite everything that happened during the weekend, Hamilton's work had been surgical, that had squeezed the SF-25 until the last millimeter available. And Lewis's response, although brief, was just as powerful. "Yeah, great job, mate. Just the beginning." That is only the beginning was not an empty motivational phrase. It was a coded message in and out. Inward, it meant that it began to see signs of life in a car that until a few hours ago considered practically uncontrollable. And out, it was a warning to the rest of the grill. I do not underestimate this pilot or this team. Trust was not completely restored, but it had been reactivated. The most revealing, however, came in the next exchange. Hamilton, with his usual competitive instinct, immediately asked, "How far are we off?" It was not a rhetorical question. I wanted to know exactly how far the leading rhythm had remained. Riccardo Adami responded with the precise information. Half second of the first, but only 2/10 of the third position. That minimal difference with the podium on a track as technical as Barcelona changed everything. Why was that margin so important? Because it evidenced that the updates applied to SF-25, especially those obliged by the new regulations on flexible front spoilers, were beginning to take effect. The FIA had forced all teams to redesign one of the most sensitive parts of aerodynamics, and Ferrari was one of the most affected. The classification in Spain was, then, the first real opportunity to see if the changes were working. And the verdict was clear. They are not perfect, but they are on the right path. That data also triggered a signal inside the factory in Maranello. 4 weeks, the technical department had worked to counter-relage to adapt the car to the new regulatory parameters. Each modification to the spoiler generates a domino effect on the rest of the car. It affects the flow to the ground, alters the balance sheet, and completely changes the sensation of the pilot in braking and curve entrance. That Hamilton was so close to top 3 meant that this work was beginning to bear fruit. But the most interesting is not only the technical aspect, but the emotional. Hamilton, a pilot who has won world titles from disadvantaged positions, knows the value of perception. And at that time, with that radio message, he planted a seed. It wasn't just optimism. It was conviction. It was the first time since he dressed in red that he was heard projecting to the future clearly. Until that day, his speech had been prudent, almost resigned. But now he spoke as he did in his best times with Mercedes, looking forward, looking for more, asking for more. This conversation, brief but revealing, marks a turning point. Not only for what was said, but for how it was said. For the tone, for the context, and for the implications it has for the rest of the championship. From this moment on, Hamilton is no longer just a pilot adapting. It is a contender who begins to feel an integral part of the project. And that, for Ferrari, can be the ingredient that was missing to go from being aspiring frustrated to real threats. The real turn in the history of Lewis Hamilton with Ferrari during the 2025 Grand Prix of Spain did not occur solely on the track, or in a timetable. The most important change was internal, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but evident for those who know the nuances of the technical and emotional language of an elite pilot. Because what manifested on Saturday was not just an improvement in performance. It was a metamorphosis in the relationship between Hamilton and its car. A transformation that many considered unlikely after the disappointing results of the first races. After the classification, Hamilton did not just celebrate a 5th place. In his subsequent statements, he explained in detail that during Friday's training, the SF-25 had suffered a critical failure on the floor of the car, a breakdown that completely destabilized the aerodynamic load. It was then that he revealed that they had lost a lot of aerodynamic load, but they managed to fix it and the car felt much better today. This phrase, loaded with technical content, reflects the essence of what it means to run on the cusp of motoring. The smallest error in a hidden zone of the car can turn a weekend into a disaster or a redemption. The floor of a modern F1 is not a simple structural piece. It is the epicenter of the entire aerodynamic concept. It controls the airflow that determines the soil effect, that phenomenon that allows current cars to adhere to the asphalt as if they were magnets. When that piece fails even in a minimum millimeter tolerance, the whole car enters crisis. It loses traction, compromises balance, and unleashes a chain of reactions that the pilot perceives immediately. For Hamilton, which has based much of its success on the surgical precision with which each curve manages, it was simply impossible to compete with a car in those conditions. And yet, less than 24 hours later, he spoke with clarity and security that had not been heard since 2021. The phrase he pronounced at the end of his speech, "has spent so much time, I am pointing to that tomorrow," it was not a simple illusion on the podium. It was a testimony that something had changed inside him. Because what he had recovered was not only a competitive level, but something much more difficult to quantify: trust. Confidence that the team could answer. Confidence that the car had a performance roof still discover. But, above all, confidence that he could still make a difference. And that is not something less. Because when a pilot like Hamilton feels that it can make a difference, it activates a mental machinery that has led him to conquer 7 titles. It is not just piloting faster, but about becoming the central axis of a technical project. To understand the car in its essence. Knowing exactly what you need to change to go further. And this point is essential to understand the dimension of this block. Hamilton was not only driving better, he was starting to integrate the Ferrari into his driving style, not the other way around. This difference is fundamental. Because during his years in Mercedes, it was the car that developed around his pilot. In Ferrari, that process has been reverse. He has had to adapt. And after months of frustrations, it seems to be finding the balance point. Technically, this means an adaptation to a different philosophy of curve, braking, front axle response. But emotionally, it means much more. It means that it begins to feel that it belongs there. There are no empty statements when Hamilton is allowed to say that he points to the podium. Each word that pronounces is loaded with a story, of a context. of a memory of what it is to win in Formula One. He knows what he implies being up there. He has done it in all ages with different cars against different rivals. That at that time, and under those conditions he declares himself ready to fight, implies that he has visualized the way to get there. And all this, in reality, is born from a technical improvement. But a technical improvement that activates a transformation. Because in this sport, performance and trust go hand in hand. Lewis Hamilton's radio conversation after the classification of the Spain 2025 Grand Prix was not simply a routine exchange between pilot and engineer. It was a statement, a warning, a revelation. It was, in essence, a manifesto compressed in a handful of words that encapsulate a personal, technical, and sports transformation. When he said, just the beginning, he didn't speak only of that weekend. He talked about a new stage, of a current reconstruction. And from a message addressed to each rival who still doubts the impact that a motivated Hamilton can have, with a Ferrari that begins timidly to respond. That seemingly simple phrase reflects something much deeper, the rebirth of a winning mentality. And the most powerful thing about that mentality is that it does not need a first place in classification or an immediate victory. It only needs a clear sign that the road exists. Because a champion like Hamilton does not need guarantees, he needs purpose. You need direction. And in Montmello, after weeks of doubt, he finally found both. And that leads us to the inevitable question. Was this radio just a reflection of a good Saturday, or was it the first page of something much bigger? Are we facing the rebirth of a titan, or before one of those flashes that go out before lighting the fuse? Now it's your turn. Do you think this moment really marks the beginning of Hamilton's resurrection with Ferrari?